Welcome, everyone. Can you all hear me okay? You can all hear me. If you are interested in getting some food, as thank you for whoever started this line, the students started, feel free to come up and get something. It's location, but it's what we have in this room. So, and get started with that. But we are going to start with introductions and just get things rolling because there are a bunch of people online who are waiting for us. So we're going to go ahead and do this. Before we begin, I do want to acknowledge that Western Washington University's main campus is situated on the ancestral homelands of the Coast Salish peoples, who have lived in the Salish Sea Basin all throughout the San Juan Islands and the North Cascades watershed from time immemorial. We express our deepest respects and gratitude to our Indigenous neighbors for their enduring care and protection of our shared lands and waterways. For those of you who don't know me, I am Mary Sass. I am the department chair in management, and Matt Roloffs is the department chair in economics, and we welcome all of you and all those of you who are online to this amazing presentation or panel and presentation that we are about to have, exploring the impacts that trade and our current political environment is having on the Pacific Northwest. So we appreciate all of you being here, and thank you to all those of you who are able to join online. And before we get started, I do want to hand the mic over to Matt, who is going to talk just for a minute about the Paul Stohr lecture, memorial lecture series. And so he's going to talk, and then I'll get back and I will introduce our panelists.
Great, thanks, Mary. As Mary said, I'm Matt Roloffs. I'm the chair of the economics department here at Western. Although today I'm really here primarily as a representative and to speak a little bit about Paul Stohr and the Paul Stohr Memorial Fund. So the fund is one of the sponsors for today, and quite honestly, this is one of the best parts of my job as chair, is that every year I get a chance to talk about my friend and colleague, Paul Stohr. Paul earned his BA and MA degrees in economics from the University of Toronto and his PhD in economics from the University of Western Ontario. After spending time working at the Bank of Canada and teaching at the University of Quebec in Montreal, Paul and his family, his wife Tina and their children Leah and Nick, moved to Bellingham in 1996. I arrived at Western a year later, and Paul and I immediately had a connection as we were the two youngsters in the department, if you can believe that. And in his many years at Western, Paul established himself as a respected teacher, scholar, and for many of us in the room, I see a number of Paul's former colleagues here, a leader and a mentor. Paul taught courses and conducted research in macroeconomics, money and banking, labor economics, Canadian economic policy, and the business and economic relationships between the U.S. and Canada. Paul was a five-time recipient of the CBE Dean's Research Award and was recognized in 2004 as the university's Excellence in Teaching Award. He served as the editor of the Northwest Journal of Business and Economics in the early 2000s and was a valuable member for many years of the board of the Pacific Northwest Regional Economic Conference. Finally, and with a quiet and confident and loyal style that I've come to appreciate more and more in my time as chair, Paul was our department chair from 2007 to 2013. The department, the university, the Pacific Northwest region, and the discipline of economics were all deeply changed for the better through Paul's dedicated work and efforts, and we miss him a great deal. The fund, the Paul Stohr Memorial Fund, was established in Paul's honor in 2016. The purpose of the fund is twofold. First, to support and present an annual lecture on the state of Canada-U.S. business and economic relations, in this case, the effect of trade on the Pacific Northwest. And second, to support student attendance at that Pacific Northwest Regional Economic Conference. So thank you for giving me a couple minutes to talk about my old friend, and really glad that you're here. I'm going to hand things back to Mary to do the introductions. Paul would have loved this today.
Thank you, Matt. Before we get to the panel, I do want to just mention the fact that many of you are likely aware that it is our 50th anniversary in the College of Business and Economics. And this is one event that we are having as our celebration. We've got a year-long celebration. We are only a few months into this, and we will continue celebrating. So please be on the lookout for other lectures that are going to be happening, but also some really fun events that are going to be happening, including a float that will be going into the Memorial Day parade. So just be mindful of that, all right, and be there to support CBE. And thank you so much for being here. Now, I'd like to just extend a warm welcome to our panelists today. We have first, I'm going to introduce Lori. Lori Otto Punke is the president of the Washington Council on International Trade. She has had a very extensive career, not only in sort of the political world and understanding that, but she's also been involved in a variety of private organizations and of course, some larger organizations such as Starbucks and Microsoft. She has also acted as a senior policy advisor to the U.S. Senate leadership. And Lori also, just so you know, we have this connection because she and I are actually alumni from George Washington University. So she spent her first few years in the DC area. Jason Query is next in our panel here, and he is an associate professor of economics at Western. So many of you have maybe sat in a class with him. Are there any students of yours here? Excellent. That's what we want to hear. Jason received his PhD in economics from the University of Oregon in 2015, and he was recently on a Fulbright to Japan, and he hopefully will share a few words about what that experience was like. It's wonderful to have you back, quite honestly. And when it comes to his teaching interests, he teaches things in sports economics, microeconomic theory. But when it comes to his research, he does a lot of work on policy trade barriers inhibiting international trade. So that makes this a very relevant conversation for Jason. Finally, I would like to introduce Ted Alden. As many of you probably also are in Ted's classes right now, so hopefully you've seen him around as well. We are lucky to have Ted here as our Ross Distinguished Visiting Professor, and I have gotten to know Ted quite well, and he's a wonderful, wonderful person and really a joy to have to work with. He, prior to being at Western, he's had a very, very amazing career in terms of writing some books, in terms of he's currently a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington, D.C., but he was also a bureau chief for the Financial Times and is a columnist for foreign policy. So he's still very actively involved in providing us with a lot of information about what is happening in today's trade world. So I'd like to send a warm welcome to the three panelists, and we will get started.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mary. Can everybody hear me? I am going to make sure that I'm sharing my screen successfully. So Peter, who's helped us set this up, is free to leave. So can you tell us, Matt, whether that's working online and what's it look like up there? Oops. Custom slideshow from beginning. There we go. Is that doing it? That should be right. So I'm going to launch into this on the assumption that that is correct. Thank you, everybody, for coming on this gorgeous afternoon. Fortunately, there'll still be more than 2 hours of daylight after we get out. Thank you to Mary and to Matt for the generous introduction. And I'm delighted to be here today with Lori and with Jason to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the college and to honor Paul Storer. Here's the run of the show for today. I'm going to set the stage a bit by talking about the global trade system from a pretty high level, and then we will have discussions and some questions. And then Lori will talk looking specifically at the Pacific Northwest and at Washington State. We'll take a few more questions, and then Jason's going to bring us home talking about his experience in Japan and his expertise as a real trade economist. I play one on television, but I'm not really a trade economist. It's been a treat to have come from so many years in Washington, D.C. to teach in this state, which is the most trade-dependent state in the country. That fact is reflected in our teaching here at CBE, and especially in the work of my colleague Tom Rail in setting up the fabulous international business program that we have here. So thank you for all of your work, Tom. Is that going okay, Peter? Are we doing? Not quite. Not quite? No? Okay, we're gonna flip the display settings here. Yeah, unfortunately that gets us like that up on the screen. So if it's the other way online, it's still fine. They can see what I'm doing. So I'll let Peter fill with this while I go. I met Paul Storer a couple of times when I was out here before I began working here, though I did not know him well. But our stories are not entirely dissimilar. We both moved to Canada when we were pretty young. Paul from England, me from upstate New York. We both married Canadians, built our careers across the US-Canada border, writing about the expansion of trade after NAFTA, and then later about the challenges of the post-9/11 era. I wish I'd been able to talk with him during the COVID pandemic when the border was shut, and it had so many implications for those of us who live across that border. I'm not sure it will have escaped any of you. I will note it did not escape my lovely wife, who's in the back here, that the title today is extremely ambitious. I'm not sure I really have any idea what the future of world trade is, especially given the chaos of what we're doing in this country currently. Maybe Lori and Jason are more confident. But I do think at least I know the right things to watch. If I were talking to you 3 decades ago, I would have known exactly what to say. I was in Geneva on the night of December 15th, 1993, when the agreement to create the World Trade Organization was reached. I was a reporter covering those events. Negotiators had been working nonstop for weeks. I've literally never seen a man as tired as Mickey Cantor, who was Bill Clinton's trade representative when that deal was completed. But the accomplishment was a historic one. A little known, whoa, it's very different. What happened there? Hello? I've turned that one off, so hopefully that's not, but maybe you could move it away anyway. Okay, well, hopefully that won't continue. A little known footnote to the aftermath of World War II was that Harry Truman had actually wanted to create an international trade organization that would stand alongside the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank as a kind of trifecta for organizing the global economy, organizations for finance, development, and trade. But the US Congress wasn't prepared to go that far and voted down the creation of the ITO. So for many of us, the creation of the WTO almost 40 years later seemed like just another step, but a big one to be sure, in creating a world in which nations would be ever more closely linked by trade. The US and Canada had launched a comprehensive free trade agreement in 1989, the most ambitious deal in the world to date. The even more ambitious North American Free Trade Agreement, which brought in Mexico, was not far behind. The European Union had been created by the Maastricht Treaty in 1990. Oops, I should have advanced to show you the International Trade Organization. I'll get the hang of this there. European Union had been created by the Maastricht Treaty in 1992, and a common currency would soon follow. The world seemed to be uniting and integrating in ways that we had never seen before. Francis Fukuyama's extremely ambitiously titled article, The End of History, came out in 1989. He certainly overreached, but it was hard to argue at the time with his core thesis, which was that there had been, quote, an unabashed victory of economic and political liberalism. The WTO seemed to us the culmination of everything we had learned in the 20th century, that trade was a vital road to economic progress for nations of the world, and that tariffs impede economic growth, and at their worst could lead to conflict. The WTO gave institutional form to those lessons, codifying the rules of international economic liberalism, non-discrimination in the trade of goods, relatively free-flowing investment, and rules for resolving trade disputes as an alternative to tariffs. Sitting in Geneva in 1993, it certainly felt that what I was witnessing was part of a broader story of human progress on which mine and subsequent generations would keep building. So I've been doing a lot of thinking over the last year on all that has passed since Donald Trump's Liberation Day just over a year ago. I had certainly never imagined a day when a US president would stand outside the White House and proudly announce that he was levying high tariffs, not just on close allies in Europe and Japan and North America, but on poor and struggling countries like Laos, 48% tariff, or Lesotho in Africa, a 50% tariff. Somehow, he even managed to target Saint-Pierre and Miquelon, which Canadians in the room will know is a couple of little French-controlled islands off the coast of Newfoundland. Total typical annual trade with the United States is about $200,000, but they were hit with 50% tariffs too. I'm not sure I really know how we got to such an absurd place, though I've written about it as much as anyone. I wrote a book that came out just before the 2016 election called Failure to Adjust, which looked at how the United States did far too little to help those Americans who were, in the subtitle of the book, left behind by global trade. The overall benefits of the expansion in global trade following NAFTA and the WTO were enormous, to be clear. Over 1 billion people in the world climbed out of poverty in the next 2 decades. That had never been done before. And many countries in what we call the developing world closed the gap with the richer countries for the first time in more than a century. But the WTO, especially after China joined in 2001, was not such a great thing for those who worked in manufacturing in the United States. The new rules made it much easier and cheaper for multinational companies to do the same work in places like China or Mexico or Vietnam. And unlike in most of Europe, the United States has a very weak social safety net. If you lose a good job in this country, it is really hard to get back on your feet. Historians will be studying for many decades the causes and consequences of Trumpism for our country and the world. But part of the story of his success is that he captured the popular sense that the rules of the game had been rigged against ordinary Americans, which, if we pause to reflect on the history, is kind of astonishing. Those rules were written by Americans. They were our rules. And if you look at the aggregate success of the US economy over the last several decades, we obviously benefited enormously. China was the big winner. I don't think anyone would argue with that. But we did better than any of the other advanced economies. But it is certainly possible to argue, as Trump has done so effectively, that others benefited more. That somehow Americans, especially working class Americans, were being cheated by the rules their own country had written. I'm going to leave this slide just hanging here. There are a bunch of my students in the audience, so your job is to track them down and to explain what this graph means about the last 2 decades of globalization, or the 2 decades leading up to the financial crisis, and the big winners and the big losers. During his first term, starting in 2017, the steps that Trump took to address these grievances were fairly modest. He imposed some new tariffs on China, but Barack Obama had been moving that way anyway. I think it would have happened regardless who won that election. There was a contentious renegotiation of the NAFTA with Canada and Mexico, but the final product, the USMCA, or CUSMA if you're Canadian, or TMEC if you're Mexican, we all put our own countries first in the acronyms now. The final result was largely the same. The short explanation for why not more change is that Trump never expected to be president. He did not expect to win the 2016 election. And the people he hired for the trade and economic jobs were largely conventional Republicans. And the changes that we saw were in many ways not radical ones. The second term, however, has been utterly different. Donald Trump has long wanted to run his own trade policy. He wrote it in a book back in 2000 when he was contemplating a run for president. And since January of last year, he has done just that. A slight aside here. Under the Constitution, Congress makes the nation's trade policies, not the president. But for a century, mostly in reaction to what Congress did in passing the Smoot-Hawley tariffs in 1930, the Congress has gradually handed much of that power over to the president. So Trump was able to use broadly worded emergency powers granted by the Congress back in the 1970s to rewrite the rules of the game. I spend a lot of time trying to figure out I'll put it back one slide if you want to read more about what Trump said back in 2000. I spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to describe and characterize the trade policies of the United States over the past 15 months. Lori does that too, so we feel each other's pain here. It is not easy. He has threatened, imposed, removed, altered, and reimposed tariffs in multiple different configurations. The pretexts have included US trade deficits with that country, a lack of reciprocity in tariffs, taxes on US digital giants like Amazon and Google, illegal migration, fentanyl smuggling, an ad that the province of Ontario ran during the Super Bowl with clips of Ronald Reagan talking about the virtues of free trade. That was worth a 10% tariff on Canada. Brazil's jailing of its former president, Jair Bolsonaro, who tried to overthrow the Brazilian election the same way Trump did in 2020. And finally, he threatened tariffs against Greenland and against Denmark and much of Europe because they wouldn't hand over Greenland to the United States. It is nearly impossible to discern any larger strategy at work, but I'll try. There are at least three big themes at work here. I owe the first one to my favorite trade economist, except for Jason here, of course, Richard Baldwin. He has, and my students all read Richard Baldwin, so they know who I'm talking about. He has termed Trump's approach, quote, the grievance doctrine. One of Trump's core beliefs, and this dates all the way back to the trade tussles with Japan in the 1980s, is that the United States has been betrayed and ripped off by its allies. And tariffs are a tool of revenge. The various trade deals he's negotiated, a dozen or more around the world, demand that foreign countries pay some sort of tribute to the United States, promising to invest in the United States or buy more American goods in exchange for US tariffs being lowered slightly. So grievance is the first theme. A second theme, unfettered sovereignty. Oh, I should have had that one first, but I'm going to, whoops, hold on. That's not the one I wanted there, but no, actually, that is the one I wanted. Excuse me. It's what happens when you put a new slide presentation together. Sometimes you don't get it all right. Unfettered sovereignty. So Donald Trump's entire career, long before he became president, when he was a real estate developer, has been built by rejecting rules. In his view, rules are meant to constrain ordinary people, not great men. His business and political careers were built in defiance of both rules and well-established norms. And he is comfortable with a world in which might makes right, believing that the United States, because of its size, its power, its wealth, comes out as a winner in that sort of world. And then finally, it really opens the door to influence peddling. One of the reasons Americans like rules is that they create predictability for business and their customers. Building a new factory, for example, is often a decades-long investment. And it really helps to know what the trade rules are going to be decades down the road. The Trump approach undermines all of this, which may in part explain why investment in the United States outside of AI has been falling. What this approach does instead is to open the door for all sorts of special pleading. If you don't want tariffs on your products, you need to find some way to influence the president or his top officials to offer you an exemption. This is a gift that Tim Cook, who recently stepped down from Apple, or is about to step down from Apple, offered the president when the U.S. was considering tariffs on the semiconductors that Apple uses. Trump changed his mind. It is not a coincidence that donors to the president's planned ballroom include companies that are very dependent on trade: Apple, Caterpillar, Meta, Microsoft, and others. Notice one thing I did not mention on this list, and that was some strategy for bringing back American manufacturing. President Biden, whatever you think of him, did have such a strategy. It was focused primarily on semiconductors, on clean energy, and on the revitalization of left-behind places, especially in the U.S. Midwest. Trump talks a lot about manufacturing, but his policies so far have hurt manufacturing. Most manufacturing companies in the United States depend on imported components, so tariffs raise their costs. Others rely heavily on selling to China, which has raised its own tariffs against the United States. So sales have dropped, firms have been forced to find places to cut back, and employment in manufacturing is falling rather than increasing. To head towards the end here, I want to turn now to some of the consequences of Trump's first year and what this might tell us about the future course of world trade and its impacts on our region, which Laura will talk about in more detail. I'll start by admitting that I'm actually kind of surprised that things aren't worse. When Trump rolled out the Liberation Day tariffs, I mean, these were tariffs as high as 50% on every U.S. trading partner. Many of us, I was not alone here, anticipated a 1930s style catastrophe with world trade plummeting. Other nations would retaliate, we thought. The U.S. would retaliate back, and the world would descend again into the beggar thy neighbor policies of the Great Depression, which deepened and prolonged the worst downturn in this country's history. You can see on the slide here how much more slowly trade recovered than world production. The Depression had lasting impacts that were only reversed after the Second World War. It looked briefly like this was going to happen. So China responded to Liberation Day tariffs by imposing its own retaliatory tariffs on the United States. The U.S. turned around. President Trump announced 145% tariffs on Chinese imports. Bloomberg News, I pulled this from Bloomberg, calculated that one of the ships that arrived during this period, it was about a month of 145% tariffs. The U.S. importers, to be clear, it's the U.S. importers who pay the tariffs, not the foreign company. The U.S. importers of machinery, apparel, plastics, and other goods on that container ship paid $417 million in tariffs to the U.S. government. $417 million for a single ship. Why did that not continue? The first is what the Financial Times, where I worked as a reporter for about a decade, famously dubbed the taco trade, for Trump always chickens out. I'm not confident it's always going to work, but so far it hasn't been a bad bet if you're a trader in the markets. Markets fell sharply following Liberation Day. They were down about 15%. I'm trying to remember exactly, but it was a big fall. And the White House backed off or delayed many of the tariffs. Some products, if you look at lumber from Canada, you look at steel and aluminum, you look at furniture, you look at many autos and auto parts, they're still facing much higher tariff. But the average tariff on imports has settled down to roughly 10%. That's still the highest we've seen in the United States since the 1930s, but it's not a devastatingly high tariff for most companies. A second, and I think bigger reason, is that the rest of the world did not behave as it did in the 1930s. With the exception of China, which is big enough to retaliate effectively against the United States and force us to back down, which is exactly what it did. Most countries did not raise their own tariffs against U.S. imports. It turns out that they were paying attention to the economists. Thank you, Jason. And the economists told them that the main effect of tariffs is to raise prices for your own citizens. So not only did other countries not retaliate, they quickly sought alternatives for their own trade. Canada's Prime Minister, Mark Carney, you might have heard the speech he gave in Davos in January, made that case, calling for the middle powers, as he called them, to come together and strengthen their economic ties and better resist economic pressure from the United States. Canada responded by quickly mending fences with China, which had been broken. Sorry, that's the Carney speech. I was one slide behind here. Mending fences with China, which had been broken since the daughter of the chief executive of China's telecoms giant, Huawei, was arrested in Vancouver in 2018. It was a crazy story where the Chinese retaliated by kidnapping two Canadian citizens, and there was a high-level exchange of prisoners a couple of years later. But Canada and China's relations have been in deep freeze ever since. But Carney goes to China, and they work out a deal where China removes its tariffs on exports of canola, which is a huge crop for the province of Saskatchewan. And the Canadians say they're going to import a small number of Chinese electric vehicles. Canada also improved, actually hold off on that one. Canada also improved relations with India, which had been ruptured a few years ago when the Indian government allegedly ordered the assassination of a political rival, which took place in Surrey, BC. I mean, who says nothing exciting ever happens in this part of the world? So Canada's relations with, two of its biggest trading partners outside the United States had been on ice. Carney has mended those. The Europeans, which is what I wanted this slide for, have done still more. The European Union and India, after stalling on this for about 2 decades, any of my friends involved in trade negotiations know how difficult it is to negotiate with India. But after stalling for about 2 decades, quickly concluded a comprehensive new free trade deal. And it's ambitious. It's going to eliminate about 99% of European tariffs and about 97% of Indian tariffs on European imports. None of us would have imagined that that was possible before the recent events. The EU also, included a long languishing deal with the Mercosur countries of Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay. Again, a negotiation that had been languishing for a couple of decades. And that too is going to eliminate most tariffs and create the largest free trade area in the world. It turns out the United States doesn't matter quite as much as we thought it did. The US is the largest importer in the world, but we only consume 13, 14% of the world's goods and services. Throw in China, which is a similarly challenging trading partner for most countries because it relentlessly subsidizes its exports and suppresses imports. But China accounts for about 11% of global imports. So you put those two together, that still leaves 75% of the world. And the 75% actually cares a lot about the global trading system and has been working to preserve and reshape it. World trade actually, and this is again for my friend Richard Baldwin, world trade actually held up quite well in 2025, but the US share is shrinking. We are isolating ourselves from global commerce. This response by the rest of the world is, I believe, the main reason that the Trump tariffs have been less disrupted than many of us had feared that they would be. So what does this tell us then about the question here, the future of global trade? So one possibility is that we're simply in the early stages of a greater coming disorder. We're in a bit of a tariff lull at the moment because the Supreme Court stripped President Trump of his emergency tariff authority. But the administration is teeing up new actions under a much more robust authority, which is known as Section 301. So we could see a fresh spate of US tariffs later this year. That could force other countries to retaliate this time. The USMCA, which is the successor to NAFTA, negotiated in Trump's first term, it's up for renegotiation this summer. And it started off with the administration asking Canada for a down payment, i.e. make a big concession before we'll even negotiate with you. And administration officials have gone to Mexico and said, we're not going to lower any of the tariffs we put in place. So it could be a really messy negotiation. And we don't know, obviously, what the long-term consequences are going to be of what's going on in the Gulf with the attack on Iran and its effects on energy and fertilizer trade. So we're not out of the woods yet, by any means. Another reason to worry is something I teach my students, which is called the theory of hegemonic stability. The Crib Notes version of this theory is that if you want an organized global economy, there needs to be an organizer. In the 19th century, and the organizer needs to be strong enough to either force other countries to go along with the rules, or more optimally, persuade other countries that it's in their interest to go along with the rules. Great Britain played that role in the 19th century through to World War I. And the United States has played that role since the end of World War II. But we have quit that job, and there's no obvious successor. China is the only country that might have the economic heft, but its trade policies are focused narrowly on what the leadership believes is good for China, a China-first trade policy, if you will. China has been a huge beneficiary of the US-led trading system and has no particular desire to play a leadership role. But I want to end on a more optimistic note. There is a positive trajectory in which the 75 of smaller and mid-sized countries link their economies more tightly without discriminating against the United States and China particularly. We are seeing many signs that the middle powers are doing just this. And the European Union is large enough and coordinated enough on trade policy to play something of a leadership role. We are seeing steps towards integrating the EU. I don't think it will be a formal integration, but integrating the EU with what's known as the Trans-Pacific Partnership, technically the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, but that's a mouthful. With the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is a huge trade deal that includes all of the Pacific Rim countries except for the United States because Trump pulled out in 2017. Great Britain joined the TPP in 2024. So the first bridge between Europe and Asia has already been built. It seems likely that the United States is soon going to be surrounded by a giant free trade zone from which we are excluded. To conclude here, I recently dug up a book I read back in the 1980s during my Berkeley grad school days, which was called After Hegemony by the political scientist Robert Cohen. He was grappling, a bit prematurely as it turned out, with the consequences of waning US leadership. The default prediction, the one I laid out above, is that without such leadership, the rules-based system would break down into warring factions. But Cohen laid out a compelling case that it's easier to sustain rules than it is to build them. If we were starting from scratch, as happened in the aftermath of World War II, to build a rules-based trade and financial system, it would be impossible to do so without the sort of leadership the United States provided. But it may well be possible for the rest of the world to maintain and even improve that system without the cooperation of the erstwhile hegemon, the United States. I am hopeful that this is exactly what we are seeing. The post-war economic system may have been a US-led creation, but the ideas at its core, non-discrimination, reciprocal benefits from trade, transparency in economic arrangements, consensus building, aid to countries that are facing financial crises. I could add more. These are universal ideas that transcend any single nation. They are ideas developed from the painful experience about the best ways for human beings to organize themselves on this planet in ways that help to build peace and prosperity. To finish with Paul's work, no two countries understood this better than the United States and Canada, which he straddled throughout his career. One of us, sadly, has forgotten these lessons. The world outside the US will go on with its work, but our work here in this country and in this state is to remember those lessons and try to rebuild. So thank you very much. That's me. If you haven't taken my classes, those are the ones I teach. I think the plan, and Mary inspired this, was I think we're happy to take a few questions and have a little discussion if you guys want to raise stuff. And then Laura's going to talk more about the state here. So thank you again for being here. Or we can go straight to Lori if you're quiet, but I'm sure there are questions in here. Sorry.
Ted, this is great. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what you see. I mean, I have my thoughts on this, but I think there's needed to be written too. Like, what you see is the consequences of this, U.S. becoming more of a closed economy and this isolationism. Like, for consumers, I would expect higher prices. What do you see is this doing to kind of the business environment? Maybe this is something Lori can speak to too when we are talking about the Pacific Northwest. But I'm curious of okay, then what does that mean for us?
Lori, you live this every day, and I know you're going to go into some details with your slides, but why don't you give us the high-level overview of this, like the impacts that you're seeing?
I should just hold my question for your talk.
No. I mean, that's always the danger of doing questions here. No, I think it's a perfectly good question. I think what you're going to find is, so what happened in the first Trump administration, when we put tariffs largely on China, but not on other countries, is a lot of companies developed what was called a China plus one strategy. So the idea was that you would serve other markets from outside of China, maybe by moving some of your production locations to Vietnam or Malaysia or other places. You'd produce in China for China, but you would do your global business from other locations. I think if the U.S. is living behind this tariff wall, sorry, I should have repeated the question there, Matt, but I think it'll be implicit. If the U.S. is living behind this tariff wall, I suspect, I'd be interested in Lori's comment on this, you'll see a lot of multinational companies do that. They'll have a U.S. plus one strategy. So they'll be here in the U.S. market. We're too big, we're too important, we're too innovative. But a lot of their global business, they're increasingly going to do from outside the United States as part of these zones that have more stable rules and lower or no tariffs. I mean, that would be the consequence I would anticipate if we maintain this, maybe beyond the end of this administration. I don't know what the time frame would be, but there's a microphone here, Larry.
I think Ted's spot on, and I would just add to it. I think given the rising tensions with China over the last decade, a lot of companies were already diversifying, right? And so they were going to places that DC insiders were telling them were great places to go invest in Vietnam, invest here, invest there. And then, of course, Liberation Day happens, and all these safe bets to diversify away from China were then hit with, in some cases, many cases, tariffs higher than were in China. So I think there's now a lack of, I think the biggest issue that I kind of grapple with is there's a lack of trust in what the US might do. And so how do you know to hedge your bets, which of course means that there's less certainty in betting in the US, knowing they have to be here, but just a broader uncertainty about what that's going to look like, which of course in the long run is going to increase costs and prices of US goods and services.
A little screen between us there, Ted, but so I've been reading, and I'm sure you have as well, issues related to how dominant the US dollar has been throughout the world, and how, now people are uncovering, or at least making transparent, the deals that have been made in the past related to the petro industry, and how dollars became the dominant way that all things were being traded, which gave a enormous amount of punishing ability that the U.S. had to keep others out from being powerful in the world. I'm just kind of curious how this is all playing out as this is all happening as well, and where you see that.
It's a good question. Do you want to tackle that one at all, Jason, or do you want me to make the first cut at that? Up to you. We'll repeat that. So the question was about the dominance of the U.S. dollar and the leverage that gives the United States to use the U.S. dollar as a tool of economic warfare, for want of a better term, as a sanction, and what that means kind of long term for the status of the dollar, how the world's responding to that. Is that yeah, and what will happen? Yeah, what will happen as that role erodes?
Sure. So I'll give a brief comment in that when I'm talking to my students in an international economics class, I tell them a thing that a lot of people are really worried about is the world trade deficit. And what I explain to my students is that essentially they should be happy with the U.S. having a massive world trade deficit, because what that essentially means is we're getting goods way cheaper than we honestly should be, because the rest of the world is just lending us us American consumers a bunch of money to buy things. And the reason we're able to sustain that, and the reason we've had, this budget and trade deficit for so long, is the dollar is an attractive currency in many, many ways. We have some of, if not the most robust financial markets in the world, which makes trading on our dollar very easy. And as you mentioned, most of the petrodollar and most trade in the world is negotiated using the dollar. And that's great for us, because that means when the dollar is doing great or when the dollar is doing bad, that's not negatively affecting us one way or the other on the trade aspect. And so we've been able to sustain the trade mechanism we have had for so long because of the dominance of the dollar. And so what is going to happen as whether it's just we no longer can understand what's going to, from day to day, predict what's going to happen on the US side of policy, or whatever it is, as the world starts to move away from the dollar, and they've certainly been doing that in the last year plus, is we're going to lose that ability. And to some extent, you could argue that is a success of Trump's trade policy, in that whether he genuinely cares about it or not, one thing he constantly complains about is the US trade deficits. And it'll course correct. When the dollar is much less attractive, we're not going to be able to sustain that debt for so long. And the way that fixes itself is we start importing less. And so the point I'm trying to make here is that as we lose that power, it's going to directly hurt Americans' quality of life. We've sort of been borrowing on other people's production for so long that as we lose the ability, as we lose some of the power of the dollar, that'll go away. Which, I do want to say that I don't know that I am unsure, at least, about the causal direction. I don't know if I think it's part of why we're starting to lose the power of the dollar is more that people are pulling away from the US. Whereas if you had asked me before the current administration, it might have said the other way. It could go the other way.
I mean, just the one thing I would add directly on the sanctions piece, the danger, there's a great piece in the new Foreign Affairs by Edward Fishman, who wrote the book Choke Points, and heads the center that I'm part of at the Council on Foreign Relations. And basically he argues effective sanctions are something that you more or less have a monopoly over. But when you use them, you erode the power. So China has a monopoly more or less over rare earth minerals, which are critical for all sorts of industrial applications. They've been prepared to weaponize that. The rest of the world is busy trying to figure out how to get around that. It's going to take a while, not easy to set up processing capacity, but the rest of the world's busy doing that. The US has been weaponizing the dollar for about 20 years now, using financial sanctions to go after people or countries we don't like. It originally happened in the aftermath of 9/11. And the result is countries are looking for alternatives. When the Iranians were demanding tolls for ships transiting the Strait of Hormuz, they were asking for the payments in cyber currencies, right? In cryptocurrencies. So cryptocurrencies have provided a viable alternative. And many other countries are not doing transactions in US dollars anymore. The Iranians and the Chinese, do their trade in renminbi. And so you're going to see more and more of that as countries try to evade the ability of the United States to use financial sanctions to impose our will on them. I mean, I think the reason countries used the dollar for so long is it was safe, right? It was a global currency, and the US government didn't use it in aggressive fashions, but that's not true anymore. Great question. Do we want to, Derek?
Obviously the policies that we've seen, the rigor of the tariffs have been kind of coinciding with the Trump administrations, the two Trump administrations, that is. And in this scenario that the next administration is not a Republican or Trump administration, what does the policy or initiatives, either diplomatically or economically, what would those look like in kind of mending U.S. relationships with other countries, considering the amount of impact that these tariffs have?
So the question from one of my fabulous former students was, if we have a different sort of administration in 2030 that changes tactics, how much does that go to repairing relations? I mean, I think the answer will be the relationship is not going back to what it used to be with any country, even with our closest partners like Canada. The trust just isn't there. And I think that was the message that the Canadian Prime Minister has been delivering since he took power. There's going to be a wariness about the United States. The fact that we showed that we were twice willing to elect a man like Donald Trump, the rest of the world is not going to have the sort of trust for our role that it had in the past. That said, I think there will be changes. I mean, if you look at what Joe Biden did, it's interesting. Joe Biden did not undo Donald Trump's first-term trade policies, kept the tariffs on China in place, raised them in some places. The main difference was relations with allies. So Biden wanted to build a sort of cooperative bloc with the Europeans and the Canadians and Mexicans and others. There was a phrase called friendshoring that got bandied about. And I think he saw the U.S. working closely with allies to try to resist pressure from China, China being the big problem. I can imagine that happening again after 2030, because objectively, I think that's a more sensible analysis of where the economic challenges are. And I do think the rest of the world will be willing, or much of the rest of the world will be willing to work with the United States. Again, certainly the Europeans would, the Canadians would, but it will be more arm's length warier than it was the last time around. I mean, in some ways, that is the most bizarre thing about Trump's approach, not just the tariffs, but that he levies them against long-term allies. He has no sense of the value that alliances have brought to the United States, which is mind-boggling, because we are where we are in the world because we have so many close friends. I mean, it's the big difference between the United States and China. China basically doesn't have any allies. We have had lots of allies, and we're busy annoying all of them.
One thing I would add real quick is to remember sort of, if you had asked a question about the political parties' trade stances before the first Trump administration, you would have almost certainly heard responses along the lines that the Republicans are the free trade party and the Democrats are the not free trade party. And I bring that up just to mention that, assuming the Constitution holds in 2030, it won't be Trump, even if it's a Republican. And so there is the question of, even if the Republicans win in 2030, what does that administration's trade policy look like? So it could be drastically different, because I think much of the world does view trade very differently than Trump.
I think, yeah, go ahead, Lauren. And then I think I'm going to let you we should let you do your slides here so we can talk a bit about Washington State and get that into the conversation.
Piece I would just say is I'm not convinced that in a new administration, Republican or Democrat, that we're going to snap back to a trade and tariff policy that we once had. I think allies, I think Ted's point on U.S. leadership in the world might be restored and pivot back to the way it might have been, 10 years ago. But I don't see Congress taking a quick action to undo all of these tariffs that we've seen. Once they're imposed, I think politically it is hard for a lot of members, regardless of their which side of the aisle they're on, to say, oh yeah, we're done with that. That was just a moment in time and we're going to go back to the way it was, rah, free trade. I just don't see that happening. So I am concerned about long-term viability of, how we sustain the current level of tariffs in terms of shrinking U.S. market share around the world.
I'd like to, if possible, I'd like to bring Washington State into the conversation. So,
If others have just really quick.
You want to do
I
that?
don't want to cut you
Okay.
short. Yeah.
No. I mean, and people have a lot at the end. Well, then I'm going to have to take questions from my dad here. So I was trying to get out of that, but.
That he's going to restore manufacturing in the United States. There is some suggestion that even if that were possible, there's not a labor force to do that. But in fact, young men are no longer interested in factory work, even if it were available. It seems somewhat unlikely that Trump's policies would in fact encourage an increase in manufacturing investment and activity. But beyond that, you wonder whether the labor force is there.
Yeah, the question for the online audience is even if manufacturing did start to come back to the United States as a result of the president's policies, would we have the labor force to make that work? And I think the answer is probably no. I mean, we have some examples of it here. So partly as a result of tax incentives passed by Congress in the Biden administration, we are building new semiconductor fabrication facilities in the United States. The Taiwanese and others have had to bring in workers from Asia to do the work assembling those facilities. We have not had the labor force here. In the first Trump administration, and I'm slightly embarrassed to admit this, but it was the time that I sat this far away from Ivanka Trump. She was leading an effort in the first Trump administration to create an apprenticeship program. I mean, she's a very smart young woman, and there was an effort, it never really got off the ground, but to try to address that problem by boosting apprenticeship programs for blue-collar work of all types. There's none of that going on in the current administration. And just an example on the US-Canada dimension, I was listening this morning to the Prime Minister's spring economic statement. Canadian government is putting $6 billion into training 100,000 skilled laborers in Canada. The comparable figure here would be close to 1 million, because they have all these big construction projects planned. They want to figure out how to get their resources to new markets. They don't have the labor force to do it. So they're putting a massive amount of money. So absolutely, I think even if more work returns here, we don't have the labor force for it right now. Not to say we couldn't develop it, but it doesn't exist at the moment. Yeah, good. Well, should we take one last one here, Lori, and then we'll go? Okay, one last one. Yeah, back here, yeah, please.
But earlier in your talk, you mentioned the creation of the WTO, and then you didn't say anything about the WTO after that. What happened to the WTO?
I'll give you the very short version. I mean, it's interesting. I feel slightly sad about it, right? Having been there, and all I did was report on it. But it feels like I was kind of there at the birth, and it's like watching one of your children die. What's the short version? The short version is it became possible to renegotiate it. The rules have not changed since the mid-1990s because it's a consensus system, and you now have powerful developing countries like China and India and Brazil and others that really don't want to go along with the United States and Europe anymore. The WTO was a US-Europe creation. You had China join in 2001, and we could have a long debate about it, but I think it's basically true. This is where I largely agree with Bob Lighthizer, who was Trump's first US trade representative. A state capitalist system of the sort that China has is not terribly compatible with the rules that were built into the WTO. They weren't created for that sort of economy. And I think China's actions have increasingly eroded the credibility of the WTO. And then finally, is blame for the United States, because I think instead of trying to do some of the things we could have done to help fix it, we've turned our backs on it and walked away. And without the US involved, it grows weaker and weaker. So it becomes every day more like a typical United Nations organization, where there's lots of debate and dialogue, but very little action. That said, it's still true that 85% of world trade is conducted under WTO rules. So it'll probably limp along for a long time. And maybe these other countries that I've talked about will do things to shore it up. But it's just not central anymore. All of these other agreements I've talked about, that's where the action is on global trade. Lori, let's go to you here. Do you want the lapel mic here, or do you want to use the hand mic? That'll make your life a little easier. Yeah. So
I'll give that to you.
So why don't you put that on wherever on your lapel, and you can use that to advance the slide.
Is my slide up?
Yeah, if you just
Okay.
move the first one will go there.
Okay, great.
You just use that.
Okay. Okay. Well, first of all, thanks for having me today. I appreciate both the opportunity to speak with you all oops, oh no, I've already gotten us off track here. Okay. And I just appreciate the invitation. And of course, I didn't have the opportunity to know Paul Stohr, but it's great to be in a room of people who are preserving and advancing his legacy. So I just want to also just thank Ted, who is so good about participating with the Washington Council on International Trade, which is the organization that I represent. And, you know, it's pretty basic. It's been said many times before in this room. But for Washington State, trade is really critical. 40% of jobs here are tied to international trade. And so I'm just going to spend a couple minutes bragging a lot about Washington State's amazing economy and kind of just a call to action to make sure that we are here to help preserve and support it, because it is really kind of a minor miracle and it's not talked about enough, but it's something we should all be very cognizant of and think a lot about. 1 in 4 jobs in international trade in the state, and that compared to nationally, it's 1 in 5. So it really is a competitive differentiator for us. And I think the most important thing is, you know, jobs that are tied to international trade pay more than those that are not. In addition, you know, 95% of consumers are outside of the US, so it's really important and critical that we keep markets open so we have places to send our goods and services. It's also really important that we realize that we didn't get here by luck, okay? We got here because of leadership, stewardship and leadership, both on the business side as well as on the political side. And I like to put up this timeline because it really shows how we kind of got here, and it's a great story to tell. You know, we're all known for sort of being a timber leader in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, and that industry is truly responsible for the aviation industry, because you had a lot of planes going over timberland, looking down and managing the forests. And from that, the Boeing brothers emerged, and they decided, like, hey, we're managing these forests, but what we were really interested in is aviation. And, you know, with that aviation, the Washington State became a tech hub of innovation. And from the Microsofts of the world that were, you know, went public in what was late 80s, early 90s, I don't recall. Bill Gates made a big bet and recruited Dr. Leroy Hood from Caltech, which was a big coup at the time, to bring him up here to develop the life sciences industry, which is an incredible part of the Washington state economy that I don't think we talk a lot about. And because of all of this big growth in economic activity, you had retail leaders, be it Costco, Starbucks, REI, all of the economic activity really fueled the retail industry here as well. And that has given us a real leg up. And so we've been able to, diversify, grow different other industries. And now we're leaders in things like sustainability and clean tech and sustainable aviation fuels. And now we're a leader in space as well because of this amazing ecosystem the business leaders were really at the forefront of advancing. But it wasn't just business leaders, it was political leaders. And this is kind of a funny picture. I look back and I'm watching Nixon with chopsticks, and every time I see it, it makes me laugh. But there was, the US normalized relations with China in 1978. And the following year, President Carter was in office, and he brought Premier Deng Xiaoping to the United States on a friendship tour. And of course, they went to Washington, D.C., I'm sure there was a fancy dinner. And then they went to the president's backyard in Atlanta, Georgia. And of course, everyone assumed that if they were going to bother to go to the West Coast, they'd go to California, be it San Francisco or LA or somewhere like that. But it was because of the leaders in Washington state, think of the powerful chairman of the Senate Commerce Committee, Warren Magnuson, who advocated, he was kind of an early leader in international relations and advancing sort of a more international global perspective. And he really pressed to get Henry Kissinger to bring Deng Xiaoping out here, who was very interested in that because he wanted to do a high-tech tour, which was Boeing. They went to Canlis, they toured the Port of Seattle, and really from that, I believe the Washington state got the first China-flagged vessel into the state because of Stand Bear. So again, the key takeaway is our trade footprint exists because people built it with purpose, and we have to keep on choosing it, otherwise it will go away. Again, these are just some of the key sectors and industries that I've already touched on. I don't need to spend time on that. But I'm just going to talk about some things that I think you might not know about, or I want to repeat if you do know it. Washington state agriculture continues to just be an incredible, and this also segues into why trade is important, and the trade war is very unhelpful here from an economic perspective. But there are 300 different types of crops grown in Washington state on about 15 million acres. And it's surprising, every time I hear this stat, it's surprising to me, but that's second only to California. The state, of course, we have two big regions, one on the west side, which is the more damp area, which is, really good for things like raspberries and whatnot. And then on the east side, we have the wine industry, but 75% of U.S. hops are grown in Washington state, 90% of U.S. raspberries. And potatoes are also a quiet giant here. Everyone thinks of Idaho. We are second to Idaho, but a big, big, big producer of potatoes for the country. And the wine industry has exploded here. We are now second to California. In addition to 850 wineries here, we also have $1 billion in wine tourism alone. So it's a huge industry. And of 95% of our state's 35,000 farms are family owned. So these are small businesses that are really sensitive to international trade as well. Okay, there's a little bit of just some of the crops that you've heard about and seen. Tech. Okay, so tech, of course, this is not surprising, but I think it's worth repeating. It's the single biggest pillar of the Washington state economy, about 22% of the state's GDP. It's the highest share in any state in the country, even higher than California. It's obviously home to Amazon and Microsoft, the world's most valuable companies, but it's also major operations with Google, Meta, Apple, T-Mobile, Nintendo, Valve, Expedia. And our high-tech worker concentration here is really high, 1 in 10, versus the national average, which is a lot lower than that. And if you think about it, with both AWS and Microsoft Azure, the world's top cloud providers that are headquartered here, that means that a major share of the global internet runs through Washington state-based infrastructure. So, each high-tech job is associated with four more jobs downstream. So it's super impactful here. Again, I talked a little bit about Dr. Leroy Hood and, gaming. Yeah, I got to throw in gaming too. I mean, they're the kind of quiet giant here, $13 billion. I think annual wine is around 9 or 10. So it's a really big industry here, which is a little bit separate and distinct from the tech side. Let's see, let's go to life sciences. Life sciences, as I mentioned, it's one of the top 10 clusters in the entire country, and about 50,000 people involved here in the state. It pays really well. There's a lot of women. We have a ton of women in STEM and in the life sciences sector in Washington state, which outpaces the national average. So we should be really thankful for that. And then it's also really anchored by some just fabulous institutions here, both the Fred Hutch Cancer Research Institute, the Allen Institute on Brains, and of course the National Lab. And there's a huge track record of our medical innovation, which I don't think we talk enough about. Everything from bone marrow transplants, and modern cancer immunotherapies. And now the next phase of this is really going to be in biotech's convergence with AI. So it's the next thing down the road, assuming Washington state can help incubate and support this incredible innovation. Another big place that piece that I've been talking about a little bit is aerospace. Washington is the largest and most established aerospace cluster on Earth. Obviously anchored by Boeing, which started, if you didn't know, in 1916 in a little red barn in Seattle. It has huge, revenue businesses, 200,000 jobs. It's really one of the huge anchors of the state economy. And I think one of the things that we should be really proud of is it's now leading to the next iteration of this with space, right? Because of the aerospace engineering programs that have been here, we now have Blue Origin, we have Aerojet, we have SpaceX operations here. And those things are also leading into the next generation of green innovation, aviation, I mean. So it's just, again, something that we don't talk about enough here, but it's incredibly important and a real anchor of the local economy. Forest products, I should have put this, if I was keeping it in a timeline, I would have put them first. Anyway, I do think they're also worth talking about. We're the #1 forest products export state in the country. About 25% of U.S. logs and lumber products exports by mass move through Washington state ports. And our replanting outpaces our harvesting. So for every 3 trees planted, we only harvest 1, and it captures about close to 30% of our of the state's greenhouse gas emissions. So the lumber forestry industry here is incredibly important. And then just to kind of capture it, the importance of Washington state ports, I know I often think about the ports just being Vancouver or Bellingham or Seattle, Tacoma. The port structures are all over the state, and they really facilitate not just trade for Washington state products, but 50% of all U.S. wheat comes through the Columbia port system. Just some huge, we don't grow any soy here. I got to look this up again. I think it's as high as 80% of all U.S. soy comes out of our ports. The other interesting fact about trade and why it's so important to the state is our geographic proximity to Asia and China specifically. So if you're exporting out of Seattle or Tacoma, you are a day faster than our competitors at Port Rupert or Prince Rupert or Long Beach. There's a huge competitive advantage. So that kind of sets the stage as to why this trade war really over the last 10 years, but on steroids over the past years, has had a really consequential and negative impact on our economy. Just a couple of examples I'll use, and then I'll wrap so that we have more time for questions. So we've just seen a lot of, I would say the agriculture industry is least immune from the impacts of the trade war, and they've felt it most acutely. You can look back to the Apple fight with India, U.S. imposing new tariffs, India retaliating. And some of the tragic circumstances are that as the Apple market basically collapsed from about $120 million a year to under $3 million in 2022. And then a year later, after it was resolved, we're still seeing like the depressed numbers because, customers or buyers realize that they just have other more reliable markets that they can go to. Trade is not a light switch. You can't turn it off and turn it on again and expect to get the same volume. So you're just seeing the Apple industry in particular is really a telling example of the kind of move away from the U.S. market. Well, if we can't buy it in the U.S. at the prices we want, there are plenty of other places to get it. Cherries is another similar example that we've seen. It's the prices that you can get in the international market for Washington state cherries are much higher than you can get on the domestic market. It's a very sensitive material because of the short shelf life. So when we have these major disruptions on trade, cherries have really been hit hard as well. But it's like true across all of our agriculture industries. And bottom line, farmers can't really absorb this. You know, all of their costs are up anyway because of inflation, because of fuel prices, because of fertilizer prices, because of labor prices. So they've been seeing this. Less than half of the farms in Washington state are profitable at this point. And so we're going to see a real turn away and some, you know, people just pulling up crops in order to walk. I think the other thing that you are all acutely aware of, but it's one thing when I'm talking around the state I really like to highlight is the Canada rift is really hammering Washington state. They're often our best trading, but well, they're always our best trading partner, but in terms of volume, often quarter by quarter, our biggest trading partner. And so given the cooling relationships between the US and Canada, we've seen a real fall off there, which is particularly acute and hard for Washington state. And then the last point I'd make on this is just the broader decline. Oh, sorry, I haven't really spoken to this one, but we'll get to it. The last thing I would say is, you know, at our sort of high water mark, Washington state was exporting about $90 billion a year around the globe. And that number has fallen, like in some quarters, by as much as a third. So we've really seen the dramatic decline of what it means to be a global trading partner. And we worry a lot about Washington state and its ability to kind of be this economic powerhouse of multi-diversified industries that we can be so proud of. So, you know, we're really, Washington state's economy was built with purpose by leaders who understood that the trade state's prosperity was really tied around the world. And so now the question we have is whether or not that wisdom is something we'll continue to choose. So with that, we can maybe open it up for more questions, or Jason.
Thanks very much, Laura.
Thank you.
So yeah, let's take a few more questions and then Jason will bring it home for us. Matt, did you have some online there? And then we'll go back to the room here.
I'm going to take some that came in before the talk when people signed up, a couple that have come in during the webinar, kind of mash them all together.
Perfect.
And Lori actually got to one of them already, which was the effect in Washington state in terms of agriculture. But people have asked about a number of other industries, fish in particular, fish exports, tourism, and then Boeing and Microsoft more specifically.
Do you want to take tourism? I think you should take tourism.
I can talk about tourism, but why don't you do Boeing and Microsoft first, and then I'll talk.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we've just seen, for Boeing, it's been highs and lows, right? I mean, I think we've all seen and followed some of the challenges that they've had. And I think it's just kind of not to speak to their P&L specifically, but I think given the reliance and lack of reliance on the U.S., they're seeing different markets decide to take up U.S. products and aerospace and others not. Fish, I was still trying. You sent me that one yesterday, and I have not tracked down great information on it. So if someone else on the panel can relieve me on seafood, I would be greatly appreciative.
Yeah, there have been the tariffs in Asia and tariffs in China particularly are hurting seafood exports substantially. Yeah.
And also, I think the dumping, given the war with Ukraine, the Russians have been dumping a lot of seafood as well. That is making it harder for U.S. exports. Yeah.
I mean, on the tourism piece, we've got the expert here in the room, Lori Troutman and Jennifer Bettis at the Border Policy Research Institute, who've been doing the best stuff on this, like nationally recognized works on what's happening to Canadian travel coming south. And the short version is down substantially. I mean, it's honestly personally painful for me and my family. I mean, we go back and forth between the two countries. And there are a lot of Canadians who just will not come down here. They're like, we're so upset with what's going on in the United States, with what Donald Trump has said about Canada, that we won't come down. And traffic south in this quarter is down about 30%. Is that the right number, Lori? 36 and still declining. So even worse than that. Yeah, and it didn't blow over. You know, I think there was a hope that maybe, you know, Donald Trump is no longer talking about Canada as the 51st state, that this might blow over. And it has lingered. I think all of the decline in Seattle tourism is essentially Canadians not coming down. So it's had big impacts. And of course, we're going to have the World Cup this summer. So we'll see what plays out during that. It didn't come up in the discussion, but one of the things that the Trump administration is really upset about and wants as a down payment for the negotiations is that Canadians are are on the liquor stores in Canada. They're no longer selling American wines. And so this has hurt Washington State wine substantially. It's one thing that the provinces in Canada have been able to do to retaliate. So, I mean, US-Canada relations are at the lowest point I have ever seen, and I've been paying attention to it for a long time. So, other questions?
No, that was
Okay.
like 4 of them together.
Hey, well done. Okay. Questions in the room? We could. I think we had one here from one of my students. Guy, do you still want to ask a question, or did it get asked? Did you have a question, or? Yeah, go for it.
What the job market's going to look like in Washington State in the coming years as we're graduating, and a lot of us have fears about like where are those jobs going and what should we be looking out for, and how can we like make ourselves able to get jobs in this economy.
It's a great question. Yeah. Anybody want to kick it off?
I'm looking at you.
Yeah. I wish I had a great answer for you. I wish I had a great answer for all of you. I think, weirdly enough, in the trade space, if you're willing to do customs and export-import work, which a number of our former students do, there's actually a lot of work these days because trade has become much more complicated, right? If you're calculating imports for companies or working with the ports, you now have multiple tariffs, right? It used to be there was basically a single tariff rate for most of the world, what they call the MFN tariff rate. Now you have all these specific tariff rates. So life has actually gotten very complicated in corporate Washington State in terms of managing exports and imports. So I think on that front, there's going to be a lot of work. The broader concern about AI is one I can't speak really well to. I think it is a concern. I mean, there are going to be entry-level jobs that are going to be chewed up by AI. But I guess the promise that I am making to my students, and I hope I'm right, is that if you learn to communicate effectively, to write effectively, to synthesize arguments, to be persuasive in public, that those things go a long way, that those are adaptable skills that work in a lot of different careers. And I think that's going to continue to be true going forward. So I don't know exactly what it's going to be like in this year or in 2027, but in the longer run, I'm optimistic for all of you guys. I've lots of good things have happened with my students in the past, and I think that same thing is going to be true going forward. Jason, do you want to?
Yeah, I'll just maybe add and or reiterate. I'm not an expert on this at all, but in light of how AI might shape the job market, which I think is maybe the biggest disruption you would be facing, is do things that AI can't do, which is be a human, make human connections, anticipate problems ahead of time, and just be communicative in your job with your bosses, with your clients, et cetera, is gonna go a long way. I think I have to go to Lori because she's my co-author. So I'll go to Lori first, but then I'm in fear, and I'll get you right after that. Go ahead.
And obviously Canada, British Columbia as well, that really rely on trade with Washington State. Actually, one of them is a seafood export that are actively looking for new markets. And this is a very broad brush question, but I'm curious if you're hearing different sectors, how they're sort of looking to those future trade relations. And it strikes me that the tech sector is one that's so heavily and like strongly linked between Vancouver and Seattle that those will remain regardless. But if there's other sectors that are starting to sort of reorient here in Washington State based on this uncertainty.
Yeah,
go ahead. Can I just repeat it for the online? Yeah. So I think broadly, the question is, are there sectors where the trade relationship between Washington State and British Columbia and Canada is robust enough to survive the current disruption, where there can be a kind of reorientation to maintain or strengthen those relationships? Is that a good summary? Or and what are the weaker ones that might be in peril? So,
got it.
Excellent.
That's a great question. I'll go back, and this is probably not answering your question at all, but as you know, Washington State and Canada have had such a special relationship over the years and over the decades. I think it was just like 5 years ago, there was a frost on Vancouver in BC, and wine grapes were soured, and Washington was bringing up grapes to help them make their special wine for that year. So I don't know of specific sectors that are moving. I mean, I would imagine, unfortunately, that there are many sectors, particularly in agriculture, with other sensitive, commodities and other things, where they're just looking for other places for stability. But I'm hopeful that, once we get through this period in the next couple of years, some of those relationships will return. I'm also hopeful that the USMCA review that is, apparently due by July 1 will be a positive note, because I have a hard time thinking that this administration is going to pull out of the agreement or give notice of pulling out of that agreement at this time when we are seeing such inflationary pressures, particularly given what's going on in the Gulf. So I guess my optimism is there may be some sort of a non-event on USMCA that'll allow somewhat of a relationship repair as it relates to all these industries that have had long histories together between Washington and Canada.
I hate to be pessimistic on USMCA, but I think we know what the outcome is going to be already. I mean, broadly speaking, there are three outcomes. The deal can die. It can be extended for the next, 16 years, I think, as is, or we can basically move into annual renegotiation. Mm-hmm. That's what's going to happen. We're going to move into an annual renegotiation. And that's better than the deal going away. I don't think the deal's going to go away. I think you're right. It's too important to the United States, but it means that we will live with that uncertainty going forward. And I think that's problematic for exactly the question you asked. There are going to be no guarantees of stability for the businesses that rely on North American trade. Yeah. So that's unfortunate, but it's obviously better than the deal going away, which I don't think is. I
just wanted to add, because I think this is amusing, if you don't think about the real world implications of it. The USMCA is about to come up for renegotiation, right? And the USMCA is the successor to NAFTA, and NAFTA had no NAFTA was just put into place, and NAFTA was what it was. It's actually a real downside that even Trump didn't really talk about, which is NAFTA wasn't adaptable to the world at all, and the world looked very different in 2017 than it looked in 1992 or what, 93? I should know that off the top. 92, basically, yeah. And it's coming up for renegotiation now. And if I'm being honest, the reason I think that happened is that would have been after, if Trump had two direct terms, it wouldn't be renegotiated under a Trump administration anymore. But then Trump didn't win in the last election and then won this election. And so now it's being negotiated under Trump again.
Okay, but I have to clarify one. It's not a renegotiation. We're negotiating with ourselves when we say it's a renegotiation. It's a review.
Yes.
And I know that I'm the only one who cares about this, but it's a review, not a renegotiation.
Here.
Yeah, I was going to ask about what is Washington doing about this, huge influx of fall off in exports in agriculture and these industries. Is there anything Washington can necessarily do?
You want to repeat the question? Yes.
Yeah. So the question is, given the fall off in exports in Washington, what is the state doing, and what can the state do?
I mean, trade is relational, right? So it means that a lot of the the Wheat Growers Association, the potato farm, all of their coalitions are going out and trying to mend fences and trying to convince their longtime buyers that it's worth them continuing a relationship and to continue to buy back. Riley Bouchot, who we all know and who works for the tree fruit industry, said that he was so relieved when the India tariff was remedied, even though it didn't go way down. It went down enough that people were starting to call him, how can we get, more apples out? So there's a lot of small, I don't mean small, but individualized efforts to help get these products out back into the marketplace. But bottom line, and the Washington State delegation has been very bipartisan, nonpartisan, however you want to talk about it, in terms of supporting international trade. And they do a lot of work behind the scenes trying to convince USTR and others about some of the harm that is being done through some of these broad brush tariff policies. So, I mean, I think that there's a lot of things that haven't happened that could have happened that would have made the situation worse. But unless we see sort of a pretty broad shift in U.S. trade policy, there's not a lot that, you know, individual states are going to be able to do. Other than like relieve, you know, other barriers for farmers? Like, are there things that Washington State can do to limit the tax, you know, consequence of being a farmer right now in Washington State? What are some of the local tools that they might help ameliorate to help lower costs for specific industries? But it's, you know, it's very complicated. There's not, unless the U.S. is doing a dramatic shift in tariff policy. It's going to be hard to kind of get some of those costs back for U.S. farmers and Washington farmers specifically.
Jason, I would say, do you want to make the comments you wanted to add, and then we'll see if there's some final questions. So it seems like a good time to do that. So go ahead.
I'll just use this.
You want to use that?
Okay.
Great.
I'll sit over by Ted, so I'm not reading that.
So I am following two tough acts to follow. And also I don't have any slides, so maybe a little less organized. But really, I don't have a lot to say because they summed up quite well. But I want to hit on a couple of things, which is, why does trade matter? Sort of what has the last year, let's say, but really a little bit longer than that, meant in terms of sort of the real world impacts, and then I'll end on a couple other things. Before I dive into that, I did just want to say that I never got a chance to meet Paul. We're here in honoring Paul's story, and I never got a chance to meet Paul. I had read Paul's work. I also have research in U.S.-Canadian trade relations, so of course I knew who Paul was before I ever applied for this job, but I never got a chance to meet him. My first year here at Western was the first year of the Paul Zor Memorial talks. So that is a great regret of mine, is I never got a chance to meet Paul. So I'm glad we can do this every year. It's one of the better parts of being a trade economist here at Western. Why trade matters? I will say this: if any of you have ever sat in on an economics talk, economists love to disagree with each other. They will find things wrong with what economists are doing if they can. There's lots of good things about that. It makes our research better. But it does mean that there's lots of things that economists struggle to agree with. And one of the things that almost every economist agrees with is that free trade is good. Free trade is good, and anything that gets in the way of free trade is bad. And this is fairly unequivocally true. At the national level, trade is good for the country. It raises the overall welfare, it raises the total GDP and the overall welfare of the country. And so that's why trade is good. Trade and the cooperation that trade brings has a lot of net impacts on our wallets and how much money we have, and a lot of other real world impacts that I think are important. A crisis that was a reality in my lifetime, and for many of the students in the audience probably haven't even really thought about, was the world sort of realized, oh, there's this giant hole growing in the ozone layer and it's going to have devastating effects. And the whole world sort of just got together and said, you know what? We're not going to buy things that are manufactured and produce fluorocarbons anymore. And so now you don't hear about the ozone layer very much because collective international cooperation fixed it, right? And collective international cooperation and reliance in trade, I would argue, is one of the biggest things that prevents large-scale violence or wars throughout the world. I think it creates stability in that front. And so that is what I think is some of the lasting effects of the positive effects of trade. And what I will say is, again, trade is good. That's unequivocally true. But what isn't true is that trade is good for everyone. Some people are harmed by trade. But the country overall benefits from trade. Those who benefit from trade benefit more than those who are harmed. And I think a lot of trade economists love to hang their hat on that the overall net is good, so trade is good. But we don't think enough, I would say, about who's harmed by trade. I haven't written a book on it like Ted, so he might have more to say than me. But this is one of the things I highlight whenever I'm talking about this is we need to recognize all of the impacts of trade. And I probably am overstating this a little bit, but I tell my students that I honestly believe America's inability to recognize the negative impacts on some people of trade is why Donald Trump won his first election in 2016. a lot of what Donald Trump campaigned on was the unfairness of trade to Americans. And that message hits home in areas where manufacturing jobs went away, like Michigan and other states that are widely recognized as being where the swing states where Trump got the electoral college votes he needed to win. And so even if trade is good and we recognize that these tariffs are bad, we do need to, I think, stop and think about, well, if we're going to remove these tariffs, what are we going to do for those that sort of, I don't want to say get left behind, but those who might lose their jobs, for example. And again, a trade economist is going to hang their hat on. The jobs that are going away in America are jobs that America doesn't have what's called comparative advantage in. They're the jobs Americans shouldn't be doing because we're relative to other countries, we're not very good at doing those things. Americans are really good at service jobs. We're really good at tech jobs. We're not all that relatively good at manufacturing jobs, and that's why we lost all those manufacturing jobs. And so when we're creating these jobs in the service industry, those jobs also tend to be higher paying jobs. And so if you lose your job as a manufacturer, the story is you'll eventually get retrained, go into a service industry, and you'll get paid more. And that's great, but it takes a long time and a lot of work and a lot of money to get retrained in a new job. And the 55-year-old who's a decade out from, retirement isn't really going to view that as a reliable option of going back to school, getting retrained, and then working for a couple of years to pay off all of that retraining. And so my hope for the future of trade is that we somewhat return to the realities of when I was a graduate student at the University of Oregon, which is as much free trade as we can possibly do. But I do want to hit home the message that I think we should be putting in social safety nets for those who might be harmed by it. Speaking of where we were when I was in graduate school, what Ted said, if you had asked him the question about the future of trade in 1980, he would have had the exact answer for you. But now he's not so sure. I can update that a little bit. If you had asked me that in 2011, I could have had the exact answer for you, because I did. I was a graduate student interested in international trade at the University of Oregon, and I needed to tailor my research agenda. And I recognized that the world was at a place where tariffs are never going to go away. There will always be tariffs on things for a variety of reasons, but they were as low as they were ever going to be, right? World had pretty much agreed, free trade, good. And so tariffs were as low as they're going to be. If I'm going to research things to improve international trade, because international trade improves the lives of everyone, then I should probably look at things that aren't policy related that can improve trade, because those are the only mechanisms we have left. Of course, I graduated in 2015. I started here in the fall of 2016. Donald Trump won the presidential election in 2016, and basically the first thing he did as president was remove us from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which I do think Ted, in the interest of brevity, downplayed a little bit, by the way, because essentially what that meant is, I don't know if any of you are aware of this because we've been such close partners for a very long time. The United States doesn't have a free trade agreement with Japan. But now now Canada and Mexico do, because they're in the renegotiated TPP and the United States isn't. And Japan is one of the largest economies in the world. So we just cut off a big chunk of trade we could have potentially had because of our stepping out of the TPP. So I do think we'll get back there. We'll see what that looks like ultimately. Those are really all the things I wanted to say. Just a couple of theoretical.
So I would just say it's a beautiful afternoon, but if there are a few more questions, we would be happy to take. There's some online here, Matt.
Yeah.
So we'll take a couple questions online.
So the first one's a big one, and I have a Washington State relevant one as well. So the first one is how has sort of the ramping up of immigration enforcement, ICE activities around the country and so on, affected where cross-border firms such as Microsoft station their legal immigrant staff? Seattle, Vancouver, has it changed kind of how they're organized?
I don't know. I don't know.
I do not know precisely. I don't know if Lori or Jennifer can throw anything in here. I mean, there's a lot anecdotal. Oh, sorry. Do I need to reiterate the question? Sorry. Oh, sorry, because, yeah, so the question was, has immigration enforcement forced tech companies like Microsoft and others to relocate where they do their operations to attract legal migration? There's anecdotal stuff about moves to Vancouver. Microsoft has set up an operation there now. There are a lot of other American companies that have operations there now. Canada is certainly actively trying to recruit immigrants in the United States. They have an open campaign to offer a quick path to permanent status for tech workers in the United States on H-1B visas and others. So they're actively trying to poach some of the immigrant tech talent. But I do not have a really good sense of whether the companies systematically are relocating to take advantage of that. I mean, they're all expanding in India. So a lot of the tech talent is coming from India. So the tech companies are all expanding there to take advantage of that in India. I mean, more broadly speaking, I'm worried about the decline of foreign students. I mean, we're here at a university, and foreign student numbers, I've been watching this since the 9/11 attacks, where we saw a decline, but then a recovery. There have been these incidents over the last 2 decades that led us to believe, well, maybe this is the thing that discourages foreign students. I think this time around, we're actually seeing that. We're seeing the foreign student numbers go down dramatically. The opportunities for foreign students to find work after they graduate have been reduced because of changes to the H-1B program. And I think the fears about getting caught up in the extremely aggressive immigration enforcement we are seeing right now, unprecedented in all of our lifetimes, I think are discouraging a lot of people. So I think a broader answer to that question is immigration enforcement is going to have a lot of impact on what has for decades, I would argue, been the greatest competitive advantage the United States has, which is we are this magnet for talent from around the world. Smart people everywhere have wanted to come here. That is changing, I'm afraid, and I'm worried about it.
A quick ask, the one that's a little bit more Washington-centric. It's about the new millionaires tax. And so the question is whether or not, or what kind of effects do you think we might see from that new tax if it does impact small companies' willingness to start, relocate? Is there a trade effect downstream from that?
I'm going to only take one aspect of that question. If the question was about the new millionaires tax and what an effect might be on small business and others, I was at Rick Steves' presentation here a couple of weeks ago, and Rick Steves thinks the millionaires tax is a great idea, and he's going to pay a lot of money under it. But do any others want to tackle that one?
I think overall, my lane is trade, but I do hear a lot from particularly our small members, our smaller sized company members who, I feel like they've been saying it's like death by 1,000 cuts right now. At the federal level, they're seeing the high impacts of the tariff policy, and at the local level, a lot higher tax issues. And so, one of the things I've been continuing to say is, we didn't get to this amazing economy in Washington state by accident. It was through very thoughtful and deliberate planning by a lot of smart people, both in the public sector and in the private sector. And so without commenting specifically on tax policy, smaller companies in particular are paying a lot right now, more than they used to. And given the fluidity of where jobs can be based in a post-COVID world, there are a lot of states that are aggressively recruiting companies to be headquartered outside of Seattle and outside of Washington state. So I think from a competitive advantage perspective, Washington really needs to keep its eye on the ball and not lose sight of the amazing economy that has been built and nurtured here, because there is a lot of easy other states that are very nearby neighbors that are actively recruiting Washington state businesses.
Okay. One or two more questions. Sorry, Zoe, you had a question. I have to go to my daughter though. and this is a question I hope in a personal capacity and not as a reporter. Good stuff.
How much of that is a lack of skill versus a lack of interest from companies to pay Canadian or American wages or ability?
This is so the question is the shortage in what we broadly term skilled labor. I don't actually love the term, but the shortage, how much of that is an actual shortage in numbers and how much of that is companies don't raise wages enough? Jason, do you want to tackle that as a comment? I mean, I can offer an answer, but I think the simple answer is companies are not paying enough because if the wages were higher, the workforce would follow. I think there's a lot of people who argue that labor shortages broadly are an odd concept in economics, because if there's really a shortage, then the wages will rise. Now, in internationally competitive industries, we can argue that companies may relocate abroad as opposed to paying the wages that they had to pay in the United States. I do think in a lot of the trades, and this is much squishier, I think there are other things that have gone on, and I think it does connect to the trade stuff to some extent. I mean, to the extent that you watched what was going on in the 1970s and 1980s and 1990s in manufacturing in the United States, I think a lot of parents said to their kids, look, those are jobs that can be outsourced. Those are jobs that can move. Don't do that. Go to college, get a 4-year degree. The data on the benefits of getting a 4-year degree have for many years been unquestionable, right? 4-year grads have done much better than just high school graduates or people who went through community college. The numbers on that are starting to change in some interesting ways. And I think there are a lot of reasons for parents these days to be a little more open-minded if their kids want to go into carpentry or plumbing or other skilled trades, because there's a generation that's retiring from that. The demand is rising, and the outperformance of college wages is really starting to shrink. So I think we might begin to see the dynamics change. But what the earlier question got at was the time problem. Like, I think there is a real crunch now with demand for these trades going up and the personnel not being there. And so you can wait and sort of let the market sort it out. What they've decided to do in Canada is to try to intervene to accelerate, student loans and grants and other programs to try to get young people to go into those fields, which I think probably makes sense. Does that answer your question? Decently well, not bad for that.
Yeah, I get that. Microwave.
Right, yeah.
Microphone.
But just expand on that a little. One thing I note to bring it back to the trade is the idea of not only outsourceable jobs, but sort of tradable industries, right? You have lots of jobs in the United States that don't require a 4-year university degree, like carpentry, plumbing, electricians, who you'll note they get paid very well, right? And the reason for that is, to some extent at least, I'm not gonna say it's the only reason. I'm a trade economist and I wear my biases on my sleeve, but you can't export that, right? You can't have a Chinese worker or an Indian worker come fix the electricity in your house. It has to be local, right? And so because those jobs are untradeable, they're not facing competition from lower wages abroad. Whereas the manufacturing jobs that we talked about leaving the United States, and could those jobs come back to the United States? I think the jobs absolutely could come back to the United States if we're willing to pay them. And the question on who's willing to pay them could be both the companies themselves and us as the consumers through, we'd have to pay higher prices if we're going to pay US workers more, Canadian workers more to do that labor. And so I think that's part of it, is the focus on tradable versus non-tradable industries. And so if it's a tradable industry, we're always going to have to compete with, like, where China in the early 2000s got their comparative advantage was largely through low-cost labor. They weren't better than us at manufacturing anything. They could just do it much cheaper because they were paying their workers much less than American workers demanded. And that's because of outside opportunities, amongst other things. And so, I mean, depending on what foreign trade policy looks like moving forward, I'm not even sure that we can fix that with time, in that as long as there are outside opportunities of higher paying jobs, we would have to, as Americans, pay our manufacturers higher wages than the rest of the world does. And so I'm not sure we're ever going to have a comparative advantage in manufacturing for that very reason. Feel free to disagree.
I could take one last question. Are we okay? Let's do William, and then we might call it, because at Western Washington, 2 hours per class means 1 hour and 50 minutes. So we're running up on that. So why don't we give you the last shot here? Yeah.
So obviously the US very reliant on tech. Our tech industries have been growing rapidly in the last century, and in the last few years with AI. Do you guys think that Trump could possibly levy tariffs on important items for tech industries? Do you think that's possible? Do you think he's willing to take that step? And if he is willing to take that step, what do you think the possible outcomes of that would be? Would our tech industries flail about
That's great. So the question is tech has been an incredibly important industry for the United States, still a major source of our competitive advantage in the world. Is there any danger that President Trump could target those industries with tariffs, and what would the effect be? Do you want to start with that, Lori, or do you want me to?
Why don't you start it?
So far, the answer has been no. I think there is an awareness in the White House and in his cabinet of the importance of these industries. I don't exactly like the way they're doing it, but the administration has gone to bat for our tech giants around the world. I mean, we're trying to dismantle laws and regulations in the US, which are seen as harming, Amazon and Meta and Google and others. We basically forced Canada to withdraw its digital services tax, which has been an effort to extract some revenue from Meta and other companies. And the places where tariffs have been proposed, I had the slide on Apple. So semiconductors, there was talk about imposing tariffs. Pharmaceuticals is another area, a lot of high tech in the life sciences. So far, there have been massive exemptions from those tariffs, and the actions taken have in no obvious way harmed the big tech companies. I anticipate that will continue, and it's a little bit crass, but I think the tech companies understand how the game is played, right? They have developed close relationships with the president. They're willing to put money into the president's projects. They put a ton of money into his inauguration. They're putting money into his ballroom. I think they're spending the money they need to spend to make sure that their business interests are not harmed by this administration. And so far, I think that's been pretty successful. I don't know if you want to weigh in on this.
Yeah.
You still got here, so you can just talk. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
I think the only thing I would add to it is I don't see the threat to tech coming at the federal level under this administration. I agree wholeheartedly with what Ted said. I do think you're starting to get a lot of state and local pushback against tech, particularly as it relates to data centers, energy crunch, infrastructure use, and those parts and pieces are going to be, I think, sort of the epicenter of the policy debate around tech from a US perspective. So I think how the tech companies navigate that piece right now is going to be critically important. And I've got 3 kids who are asking the same, they're a little bit younger than you guys, but they're asking the same questions, like, am I going to have a job? Like, they're in high school, like all these things. And I'm like, you should go look at the energy sector, because that's a really interesting place that they're going to need a lot of smart people and a lot of jobs, a lot of job creation there. And so I think that's going to be the bright line in the debate. It's not going to be at the federal level under this administration. And candidly, I don't see a lot of effective pressure from Congress on this or anything else. So, I mean, they talk a big game on many issues, and they are pretty feckless in executing on policy. So that's where I would see the fight being.
Fabulous. I think. Did you want to add one more thing, Jason? Or? Yeah. No, please.
I would just add that I think it was Ted that talked about this a little bit, but during the Biden administration, there was push on this side of things to bring some of that stuff that's done overseas in tech to America. But it wasn't through tariffs. It was through subsidizing the manufacturing of these production plants, things like that. And so if anyone wants to listen to a trade economist on trade policy out there, if that's a thing we want to do, that's the way to go about it, is subsidizing bringing that stuff here rather than taxing it, which is just going to raise prices for our people.
Well, I may take the prerogative here to call it at 10 minutes to the hour. It's a beautiful afternoon, and I don't want to keep you any longer. I think Lori and Jason and I'd be happy to stay up here and answer a few more questions, and if anybody has them. And thank you all for coming, and thanks to the audience online.
Thank you, guys.